She ran from the altar in a wedding gown, crashed into a stranger's car, and unknowingly into the life of a hidden billionaire. What followed was a heart-racing escape, a battle for freedom, and a choice that would change everything. Will she reclaim her life, or be pulled back into a world that tried to own her? Where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful emotional stories like this one. Elena Ross stood motionless in front of the full-length mirror, her breath shallow, hands trembling as they clutched the edges of her bouquet. The white satin gown fit her perfectly. Every stitch a masterpiece of craftsmanship, but it felt more like a prison than a dream. Her reflection showed a stunning young woman with auburn curls pinned back, eyes shimmering with unshed tears, lips painted into a soft, elegant smile. But none of it was real. None of it belonged to her. Not this day. Not this marriage. Not even this life. Behind her, the heavy oak doors of the bridal suite creaked open, and her father's voice pierced the room like a blade. "You will walk down that aisle in 30 minutes, Elena. I don't want to hear another word about it." Richard Ross entered with his usual presence, broad shoulders, slick gray hair combed immaculately, a black tuxedo tailored within an inch of perfection. A former giant in real estate, now aging and desperate to save his legacy, Richard saw his daughter's wedding not as a celebration, but as a transaction, a merger. Elena turned to face him, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Dad," she said through clenched teeth, "I can't do this. I can't marry Grant. I don't love him. We haven't even spoken like real people in months." "This isn't about love," Richard snapped. "It's about partnership. Survival. The Whitmore family owns half the shipping channels on the East Coast. Their investments will save us from bankruptcy." "In exchange for my freedom?" she asked bitterly. "I'm not a bargaining chip." From the corner of the room, Diana Ross wrung her pearl necklace nervously. "Elena, sweetheart," her mother began, voice strained and polite, "just think of the future, the family name, the opportunity." "My future doesn't include being someone's silent wife," Elena interrupted, voice rising. "You want me to play nice while you marry me off to a smug, condescending control freak who talks more about stock portfolios than feelings?" Richard's jaw clenched. "Grant is respectable, influential. He's offering you a life of comfort, and frankly, you owe this family some loyalty." "Loyalty?" Her voice cracked. "You're asking me to sign away my soul because you overleveraged every property in 3 states and now need a bailout? That's not loyalty, that's desperation." "Elena," his voice dropped, low and threatening, "if you walk out of this wedding, you'll regret it. You'll throw away everything, your inheritance, your home, everything we've given you." "Everything you've given me?" she echoed, eyes narrowing. "You gave me expectations, rules, suffocation. Never a choice." For a moment no one spoke. The silence buzzed between them like electricity. Then, like something inside her snapped, Elena dropped her bouquet, the roses scattering across the carpet like a final act of defiance. She lifted her gown and marched past her parents without another word. Her heels clicked furiously down the marble corridor as gasps followed her from stunned wedding staff. She passed Grant at the end of the hallway, tall, composed, and already angry. He called her name, but she didn't look back. Elena ripped off her shoes mid-run, bare feet slapping against the tile. The hotel lobby loomed ahead, filled with polished floors and polished people, but she saw none of them. She shoved through the front doors into the bright noon sunlight, squinting as she stumbled across the circular driveway. Her eyes darted across the rows of cars, limousines, sedans, one red convertible without keys, no time, until she spotted a sleek silver SUV idling at the curb, engine purring, hazard lights blinking. No one in sight. She darted for it. The door was unlocked. She flung herself inside, wedding gown ballooning awkwardly around the driver's seat. The vehicle smelled like leather and sandalwood, cool jazz humming from the speakers. It felt expensive. Definitely stolen. She didn't care. Elena shifted the gear, praying the keys were inside. Just then, the passenger door yanked open, and a man in his mid-30s tumbled in, eyes wide with alarm. "What the? Who are you?" "I'm sorry," Elena yelled, slamming her foot on the gas. "I need to borrow your car." "Borrow? What?" But the SUV shot forward, tires squealing as the hotel's circular drive blurred past. From behind them, shouts echoed, Grant's voice, her father's, in chaos. Elena gripped the wheel, wind whipping her veil loose. The man beside her grabbed the dashboard and shouted, "You're going to crash!" She swerved just in time to avoid a stone fountain, clipping a flower pot instead. The man groaned, planting his feet on the floorboard. "You really are running away from a wedding, aren't you?" he muttered. "I wasn't supposed to," Elena said breathlessly. "I was supposed to smile and obey. I couldn't breathe in there." "Great," he said dryly. "I'm your escape car. Fantastic." But he didn't tell her to stop. He didn't call the police. And in the seconds of silence that followed, as Elena raced toward nowhere with a stranger in the passenger seat, she realized she didn't feel fear anymore. She felt alive. Terrified, yes. Reckless, absolutely. But finally, unapologetically, free. The silence inside the SUV was thick, but the road ahead was anything but quiet. Horns blared as Elena swerved through traffic, still in her wedding dress, bare feet pressing awkwardly against the pedals. Her heart thundered in her chest, and adrenaline buzzed like fire through her veins. Beside her, the stranger, who she'd just essentially kidnapped, was gripping the door handle like a man bracing for impact. "Okay, slow down," he barked, trying to stay calm. "Seriously, slow down." "I can't," Elena shot back, eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. "If they find me, they'll drag me back. I'm not going back." "To the altar?" "To that deal," she hissed. "To that life." They took a sharp right onto a side street. The SUV rocked violently, her gown tangling around her legs. In the rear view, the hotel was already a shrinking speck, but it wasn't over. Her father had money, power, connections. He'd come for her, that much she knew. "I don't even know your name," the man beside her muttered, exasperated. "Elena," she said. "Elena Ross." "Well, Elena Ross, I'm Nate Blake, and this was my car." Before she could process that, a delivery truck suddenly pulled out from an alley. Elena jerked the wheel hard, but the SUV clipped the truck's rear bumper with a metallic crunch that echoed through her bones. The car spun slightly before lurching to a stop, smoke curling from the hood. For a second, all she heard was her own ragged breathing and the soft jazz still playing from the dashboard. "Oh God," she whispered, staring through the cracked windshield. "What have I done?" Nate leaned back in his seat, eyes wide but somehow composed. "You crashed into a truck," he said flatly. "That was quite an entrance." "I didn't mean to," she stammered. I panicked. I didn't think." "No, clearly." They both sat frozen for a moment, then the sound of sirens in the distance sliced through the air. Elena's stomach dropped. No, she whispered. "I can't deal with the cops right now." "Why not?" "Because I left my whole life behind. I have no phone, no ID, no money, just this stupid dress." Nate turned to her slowly, looking her over. Her veil had fallen somewhere along the drive. Her lipstick was smudged. The dress, once pristine, was now stained, wrinkled, and torn at the hem. But her eyes burned with a wild, frightened determination that made him pause. "I'll handle it," he said suddenly. "What? The cops. Let me talk to them." She blinked at him. "Why would you help me?" "Because whatever's going on, I don't think you're a criminal," he said. "Just a bride with serious second thoughts, and because you just totaled my car, it's the least you can let me do." The police cruiser pulled up behind them, lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, one tall and stern-faced, the other younger, still adjusting his hat. They approached cautiously, eyes scanning the scene. "You two okay?" the female officer asked, glancing between the wrecked SUV and the mismatched pair. A distraught bride and a sharp-dressed man who looked like he'd just stepped out of a boardroom. "We're fine," Nate said quickly, stepping in front of Elena. "Accident. My vehicle. No injuries." "Miss?" the officer asked, eyes narrowing as she took in Elena's appearance. "You in any kind of trouble?" Elena hesitated. Her throat dried up. "She's just shaken," Nate cut in smoothly. "Wedding nerves. Bit of a runaway situation, but nothing illegal." "You have ID?" "I do." He handed over his license while Elena clutched her arms, silently begging the earth to swallow her whole. After a moment, the officers exchanged glances and relaxed slightly. "All right," the woman said. "No charges, but we'll need to file a report. You'll need a tow." "Already called," Nate lied, then gently ushered Elena toward the sidewalk. "We'll wait there." The police returned to their cruiser. Elena dropped onto the curb, burying her face in her hands. Nate stood beside her, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You do realize this puts me in a very complicated position," he said. "I know," she murmured. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to involve anyone else." Yeah, well, here we are. He glanced down at the torn lace pooled around her feet. What's your plan now? She looked up at him, eyes rimmed with tears. I don't have one. He exhaled, then glanced at his watch. All right, I've got a loft not far from here. You can crash there. 1 day, 2, max. You need time to figure things out, I get it. But I'm not your babysitter. She blinked. You'd really let me stay? I'd rather not leave you crying on a curb in a wedding dress. The tow truck arrived with a groan. Nate signed the paperwork while Alina stood quietly nearby, trying not to crumble. When everything was done, he hailed a cab. The driver stared in disbelief as they climbed in, her still in that ruined dress, him in his tailored shirt now smudged with dirt and tension. As they pulled away, Alina leaned her head against the window. She didn't know where this road was taking her. But for the first time in days, maybe years, she wasn't being told what to do. She had no idea who Nate Blake really was, but for now, he was the only person not trying to own her. And that was enough. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the 17th floor of a sleek, modern high-rise. Elena followed Nate down a quiet hallway, her dress brushing the floor like a ghost of the life she'd just fled. She was exhausted, mentally, physically, emotionally, but something about Nate's quiet demeanor steadied her nerves. He didn't ask too many questions. He didn't prod. He simply walked ahead, hands in his pockets, a man who somehow seemed both unbothered and profoundly aware. He unlocked the door to his loft and stepped aside to let her in first. Elena hesitated, then crossed the threshold and stopped. The space was breathtaking. Not in an ostentatious, look how rich I am kind of way. No chandeliers or golden trim, just clean lines, warm wooden floors, tall windows that framed the city like a living painting, and furniture that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. Everything had its place, minimalist, tasteful, intentional. You call this a place to crash? She said, trying to sound sarcastic, but it came out more like awe. Nate cracked a small grin. It's one of a few. I like to stay low profile. She turned to look at him. You're not exactly giving starving artist. Not exactly, he replied, heading toward the open kitchen. You can wash up, bathrooms down the hall on the left. She glanced down at herself. The dress was a mess, torn, dirty, sweat-streaked. Her makeup had melted into the hollows of her face and her bare feet were stained from city grime. Do you have anything I could wear? I didn't pack a bag. Nate disappeared into another room and returned with a plain black t-shirt and soft drawstring pants. These might be a bit big, but they're clean. She gave him a tight, grateful smile and vanished into the bathroom. The moment the door clicked shut, her shoulders dropped for the first time since leaving the hotel. She peeled off the dress with shaking fingers. It crumpled onto the tile floor like a snake shedding its skin. The last symbol of the life she was expected to live, now limp and useless. She stared at herself in the mirror. No veil, no jewelry, just a woman stripped down to who she really was, tired, scared, but alive. After a quick rinse at the sink, she slipped into Nate's clothes. The cotton swallowed her, but it felt oddly comforting, like a protective shell, borrowed but safe. When she re-entered the loft, Nate was placing 2 glasses of water on the kitchen counter. He nodded toward one of the stools. Drink. You look like you haven't had a sip since the Civil War. She chuckled dryly and sat. The water was ice cold and tasted like a lifeline. So, he said after a pause, you want to tell me what exactly led to you hijacking my car? Elena took another sip, then set the glass down. Short version, my father's real estate empire is sinking. The man he wanted me to marry, Grant Whitmore, comes from an old money shipping family. The wedding wasn't about love, it was about leverage, a bailout. And you? I've been a pawn since I was old enough to hold a cocktail glass at one of my father's networking parties. Nate listened intently. His face didn't show judgment, just focus. That unnerved her more than any reaction he could have given. I didn't have a plan, she admitted. I just ran. Smart move, crashing a stranger's SUV, he said with a wry smile. Very subtle. I didn't know anyone was inside, she protested, then sighed. Sorry about your car. He waved it off. It's insured, just not my ideal Tuesday. She stared at him. You don't seem that shocked. Maybe I've seen crazier things than runaway brides. There was something about him, this calm, unflappable energy that made her want to ask 100 questions. But she didn't, not yet. He stood and walked toward the living room, pausing at a small side table where his phone buzzed. He silenced it quickly. Then, almost casually, he said, "If you're serious about laying low, you'll need more than just a borrowed t-shirt and optimism." She raised an eyebrow. "What do you suggest?" "I might be able to get you some work. Administrative. Nothing fancy, but it's a start." Her heart thumped. "You'd do that? You need money, right? And you don't want to be found. We can use your middle name, Grace or something. Keep things under the radar." Her throat tightened. "Grace is actually my middle name." He nodded. "Then that's convenient." She searched his face. "Why are you helping me?" Nate looked away, toward the windows and the city stretching out beyond the glass. "Maybe I know what it feels like to want to disappear for a while." Elena didn't press. Something about his answer carried weight, like a truth only half revealed. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Really. Just don't crash any more of my stuff." A faint smile tugged at her lips. Later that night, after Nate retreated to another room and the loft went quiet, Elena curled up on the plush sofa, staring out at the skyline. The lights blinked like distant stars. Her father was probably in a rage by now. Grant, humiliated. The press? She didn't even want to think about that yet. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't performing. She wasn't dressing up for someone else's approval. She was just her. And that was terrifying. But it was also the most honest thing she'd ever been. The days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm, far removed from the chaos Elena had fled. She started working under the name Elena Grace at one of Nate's smaller administrative offices, a modest but efficient company tucked in a low-key neighborhood. The pay wasn't glamorous, but it was enough to cover groceries and a little rent, though Nate kept insisting she didn't owe him a cent. Each morning, she left the loft wearing thrift store blouses and sensible flats. No one looked twice at her on the subway. No one called her by her last name. No one expected anything from her other than what was on her task list, and that, for the first time, felt like freedom. But she knew it was only a matter of time before her past caught up. That moment came on a crisp Wednesday morning. Elena had just stepped out of the train station and was walking briskly toward the office. A folder of contracts pressed to her chest. She was already running late from a morning team meeting. The city air was sharp, alive with motion. The sun cast long shadows down the sidewalk, bouncing off glass storefronts and concrete corners. She turned the final corner and stopped cold. There, leaning casually against the wall near the office entrance, was Grant Whitmore. Sharp navy suit, hair perfectly styled, smugness practically radiating off him. His eyes lit up the moment they locked with hers. "There you are," he said, pushing off the wall. "You've been hard to find, Elena." Her stomach dropped. "Don't call me that." He stepped into her path, blocking her from the door. "Your father's been tearing the city apart, looking for you. Do you have any idea what kind of mess you've caused? You walked out on a wedding that was going to save your family." "That wedding was a lie," she said firmly, voice shaking. "I didn't love you, Grant. You never even tried to love me. It was just business to you." He sneered. "And what's this?" He gestured around at the small building behind her. "This little secretary life? You think typing memos makes you independent? You're throwing away a future people would kill for." "I'd rather scrub floors than be bought and sold like a stock option," she snapped. His face darkened. In one swift movement, he grabbed her wrist. "Enough of this. You're coming with me. Now." The panic came fast, like lightning in her veins. She yanked her arm free, stepping back, her voice rising. "Don't touch me." Before Grant could say another word, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The rear doorman Nate stepped out. He was in a dark, tailored suit, calm as ever, but Elena could see the tension in his jaw. "Is there a problem here?" Nate asked, voice low and smooth. Grant looked him up and down, his recognition dawning slowly. "You're Daniel Blake," he scoffed. "No wonder she ran. You're richer than I am, that's what this is about?" Elena flushed with frustration. "This isn't about money, Grant. It never was. I left because I wanted a choice. She found someone who could buy her more freedom than I could," he sneered. "Classic." Nate stepped forward, his presence tightening the air. "Elena is not property. She's free to live her life. And if you had any decency, you'd respect that." Grant's expression twisted into a bitter smile. Her father won't stop. You think you're protecting her? You're just delaying the inevitable. You have no idea what you're getting into. I do, Nate said simply. And I'm not intimidated by a failing real estate empire or a boy with daddy's name. Before Grant could explode, Elena raised her voice. Enough. This conversation is over. She looked Grant dead in the eyes, and for the first time he seemed unsure of what to say. If my father wants to talk, he can talk to me, on my terms. But I am not your business partner. I am not your bride, and I sure as hell am not your hostage. Grant stared for a beat, jaw clenched, then jabbed a finger in Nate's direction. This isn't over. No, Elena replied. It is. For me, it's over. He turned and stormed off, disappearing into the flow of pedestrians, his expensive cologne trailing behind like sour smoke. For a moment, Elena just stood there, the adrenaline slowly ebbing out of her body. Nate stepped closer. You okay? She nodded shakily. Just tired of running. He gave her a rueful smile. Then maybe it's time we stop. That evening they sat together in the loft's kitchen, a simple dinner between them. Elena couldn't eat much. Her hands kept wringing the edge of the napkin in her lap. We need to end this, she said. For good. I can't keep hiding, hoping they'll give up. Nate nodded. Then we confront him, directly, face to face. Her breath caught. He'll never listen. He will, Nate said, voice calm but edged with resolve. Because this time, you're not alone. And I have something your father can't ignore, leverage. Elena stared at him, a slow realization dawning. You're not just helping me anymore, are you? Nate met her gaze. No, I'm standing with you. And for the first time since the day she fled, she believed they might actually win. The restaurant was quiet, its private dining room dimly lit by amber sconces and the flicker of a single candle at the center of the polished oak table. Elena sat with her back straight, fingers laced tightly in her lap beneath the tablecloth. Beside her, Nate was calm and unreadable, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, his every movement deliberate, composed. Across from them sat Richard Ross, her father. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his navy blazer sharp, but his face was lined with tension, his eyes sharp with barely restrained judgment. You've caused quite a storm, Elena, Richard began, voice even but heavy with accusation. Do you have any idea how close we are to losing everything? The Whitmore deal is dead. Your name's all over the headlines. You embarrassed me, this family, on a scale I never imagined. Elena held his gaze, refusing to shrink. I know exactly what I did, and for once in my life, I don't regret it. Richard's jaw tightened. You were raised better than this. I was raised to be silent, she shot back. To be obedient, to be pretty and useful and compliant. But I wasn't raised to be happy. That part I had to figure out on my own. Her father leaned forward, voice low. Do you think this man sitting next to you understands what it means to sacrifice for family? What it takes to build something from nothing? Nate, until now quiet, finally spoke. Actually, he said, folding his hands, I know exactly what it takes. And I also know when to walk away from something that no longer deserves to be saved. Richard's eyes narrowed. And who exactly do you think you are? Nate gave a faint smile. Daniel Nathaniel Blake, CEO of Blake Holdings. The silence that followed was thunderous. Richard blinked, his mouth opened, then closed again. It was like watching a machine reboot in real time. I beg your pardon, he said finally. I own a portfolio that spans tech, logistics, media, and yes, real estate. Nate continued smoothly. I've spent the better part of a decade avoiding publicity. I prefer quiet solutions. Discreet leverage. Richard's brows knit together. You're the one who bought the Harbor Point contracts last year. I am. And the Eastbrook Tower refinancing? That too. Elena watched her father pale. He suddenly looked older, less like the towering figure from her childhood, and more like a tired man scrambling to salvage control. So this is what it's been about? Richard said bitterly, turning to Elena. You found someone with deeper pockets than Grant and latched on. Elena stiffened. This isn't about money. This is about me choosing my life. You made your deals without asking how I felt. Nate didn't offer me a handout. He offered me a safe place to land. That's more than you've ever done. Richard leaned back slowly, as if the weight of the truth had finally settled onto his shoulders. I'm not here to destroy your company, Nate said, his tone still steady, but I am willing to help, on one condition. And that is? Richard asked warily. You stopped trying to control your daughter. Permanently. No more ultimatums, no more threats, no more trading her future like it's a commodity. Richard looked between the two of them, his face unreadable. The candle flickered in the silence. And if I say no, then you can watch your empire fall, Nate said without blinking. And I won't lift a finger. There was a long pause. Finally, Richard exhaled, deflated. All right, he said, voice low. Let's talk. What followed wasn't warm or easy, but it was honest. For the first time, Elena saw her father negotiating not with arrogance, but with recognition that his daughter was no longer a pawn on his chessboard. She was her own queen now. And Nate, he wasn't just the man beside her. He was the boundary she'd never been allowed to draw before. An hour later, Richard stood to leave. He gave his daughter a final long look. You're stronger than I gave you credit for, he said softly. Maybe too strong for your own good. Elena rose too. Maybe. But at least now I get to decide what that means. He gave a short nod, turned, and walked out. Outside, the air was cool, the city lights casting reflections onto the slick pavement. Elena and Nate walked slowly, side by side, not speaking for a moment. The pressure that had weighed on her chest for weeks seemed to lift with every step. She stopped near the edge of the sidewalk and looked at him. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet but sure. You didn't have to do any of this. But you did. Nate reached out and tucked a stray curl behind her ear. You stood up for yourself, Elena. I just stood beside you. She smiled then, genuine, grateful, and a little stunned by her own relief. You risked a lot, your privacy, your influence. I don't regret it, he said. I've spent a long time staying hidden. Maybe it's time I stop running too. Her heart thudded, warm and steady. She didn't know what came next, not really, but for the first time in her life, she didn't need a map. She had her freedom, her voice, and maybe someone who believed in both. She slipped her hand into his. Let's figure it out, she said. Together they stepped into the night, walking not toward someone else's future, but toward their own. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means you value more than just drama. You care about choices, courage, and the freedom to build a life on your own terms. Elena's journey reminds us that no matter how deeply we feel trapped, by expectations, by family, by fear, we always have the power to step out of that mold. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say no, even when everyone else expects a yes. And sometimes the right people show up not to save you, but to remind you of your strength. We'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. It's incredible how stories can connect us across the world. And if this story touched your heart or gave you something to think about, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We've got more powerful, emotional stories coming that you won't want to miss. Thank you again for being here. Your presence means everything to us.